As you can see here, we are in 1 Samuel 17. This is the valley of Sukkah. We're going to be talking about this valley. Some warfare took place here. This hill is the hill Azekah. So this is Azekah, and then this is the valley of Azekah, and then this is Sukkoth and all that jazz. So we are going to read how the Philistines encamped on this hill, and then the Israelites were on this hill, and they would go down and they'd meet for battle in the middle. And they would do this for a really long time. So this went on for quite a while, and then David's going to show up, and there's going to be all this stuff taking place. That is the picture. It's pretty modern. You can see how people have, there's agriculture and stuff there. But just imagine that there's probably a road, and there's probably little houses and stuff periodically, but generally speaking, it's kind of a wilderness kind of valley. Chapter 17, verse 1. Verse 1 reads, "Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Sukkoth, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Sukkoth and Azekah and Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them." So everything we just talked about, that's what we just read. Verse 4, "And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer went before him. And he stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, 'Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us.' And the Philistines said, 'I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man, that we may fight together.' And when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid." So they drew up for battle. And what we find in verse 16 is that this happened for 40 consecutive days. This isn't normal. Normally it would be like, hey, they're going to come in, they're going to pillage the land, Israel would rise up, fight back, send them out. And it was very momentary kind of fighting. The Philistines had garrisons, but they had been pushed out of the land pretty strong, or pretty well at this point. That's what we read in chapter 15, where it says Saul is bold, and he's delivering Israel, and he's being, a mighty warrior to save Israel from their enemies, yada, yada, yada. So the Philistines had moved into an unnormal location. They moved into Judah. Who lives in Judah? Bethlehem, the city of David, is in Judah. So the Philistines have moved into Judah, not just a portion of Israel, but a very specific portion of Israel. And this is going to be important and a little bit later. And so for 40 days, they would encamp on the hills. Their men would be up there taking it easy during the night. And then during the day, they'd just file down the hill into the valley and they'd fight. They'd skirmish. What we see nowadays in movies is back in the 80s, it'd be like, bang, somebody dies. That's not reality. Normally it's like bang, and then 18 hours later, that person dies. Because they bleed out, they suffer, they scream, they cry. Just imagine having a sword and hacking at people. These battles are not fast and they're not easy. It's hand-to-hand combat, and people are extremely tired and extremely fatigued, so it's really just kind of slowly trying to hack at each other, and they're not making any headway. They're at a stalemate. So this goes on for 40 days, but there's something unique that happens in the very beginning of each battle. For 40 days, what happens? Goliath calling people out. There is a lone warrior, a lone soldier, who breaks ranks in the Philistines. He comes into the middle of the battle and he starts shouting. I coined him the man of defiance. He is there to shame Israel. This word for defy We read in verse 9, he says, if anybody's able, let him come fight with me. Sorry, verse 10, and the Philistines said, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. That word defy is to speak sharply. We like to call it talking trash. We also like to call it cussing and cursing. He, for 40 days, sits there and derides the Israelites, and he calls them out, and he calls them all sorts of bad names. Particularly, he challenges their deity. The Israelites follow Yahweh. Yahweh is the one true God, the living God, and the Israelites are called by his name. So you have the God of Israel over Israel, and then you have the Philistines and their God. And he's going to come out and challenge them and say, my God's bigger and badder than your God. Your God's a little girl God. Sorry for the ladies. Your God is a little baby. But he's not using kind language. He's not using appropriate language. This dude's a roughneck. This dude's a gnarly guy. So he comes out and he's shouting. Why is it scary? Why does it scare the entire army of Israel? And Saul, as it says in verse 11, when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Why is that scary? Because he is massive. He is a big guy. He is 9'6" on average. This is 6 cubits in a span, is roughly 9'6". His armor weighs about 100 pounds. So this dude walks around with 100 pounds just like it's nothing. And the tip of his spear, just the metal at the tip of his spear, and his spear is massive, is 20 pounds. So this is a gnarly guy. And he steps up, and what does he say to them? What is his challenge? Why are you guys here? And where is the man who will fight me? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not Israelite? What sense does that make? When I read this, it makes no sense to me. Obviously, we're here because you're invading our land. Obviously, you're a Philistine and we're Israelites. What does that have to do with anything? Let's think back for a little bit in history. What history did Israel have with the Philistines up until this point? Remember when Saul became king? He had 3,000 people following him. He had 3,000 people in his army. And he kept 2,000. And then what did he do with the other 1,000? He sent them with Jonathan, his son. And then Saul was sitting up in his tower not doing anything. And what did Jonathan do? He attacked the Philistines and he crushed them. And then a little bit later on, Saul had 600 men and Jonathan was with the 600 men. And Jonathan's like, man, I'm bored. I need something to do today. Let's go attack the Philistines. And he's like, well, should we tell anybody? No, we'll go alone. So Jonathan's like, hey, maybe the Lord will bring us deliverance. Maybe the Lord will defeat our enemies. Who knows? Let's go up and find out. Do you remember how many soldiers of the Philistines were in the land at that point? 600 chariots, lots of wagons, innumerable soldiers. So it says you can't count how many soldiers there are. And Jonathan's like, I got this. He climbed up the rock. They're like, hey, why don't you come up here? We want to show you something. He climbs up the rock and he defeats them. And then they start to scatter. And then they start to kill each other. And the Israelites literally came out of the holes in the rocks like ants and started attacking them, and Saul got on board, and then they pushed the Philistines out. One man overthrew the Philistines in Israel, and here comes Goliath. And his challenge is this: I'm a Philistine, you're an Israelite. Why don't you send somebody up here? Since you guys are so great, where's your courage? If you defeated us with one man, come face me now. So this is back into the history of the Philistines, and the challenge is to shame them. The challenge is to say, you did it once, but you can't do it again. My God is still greater than your God. Now, here's what's interesting. Where is Jonathan? If this guy shows up and is like, I'm going to defeat you and you guys will be my slave, where's Jonathan? He is with his dad. Later on, you find out he's with his dad. He's right there in the battle. Why doesn't Jonathan step up? He's not called. There was a time, there was a place. Jonathan was called by the Lord to bring a victory to Israel in his time. And it's fascinating because at this point, he's like, sorry guys, it's not my turn. This is not a place for me to get involved. And it's important to recognize when yes means yes and no means no. And that's what's fun about Jonathan is he is such a loyal, good servant. He serves the Lord and he knows when it's not his time to move. So he stays put. The challenge is issued. I challenge you and nobody steps forward. Saul obviously is not going to step forward because he's a coward. Jonathan can step forward, but the Lord tells him not to. That's a little bit inferred. There's no written word that says the Lord told Jonathan not to. But moving forward, we're going to find out that the Lord has his champion. The Lord is designing this scene with a purpose. This is not a mistake. The Philistines did not just come out of nowhere with no purpose as if God didn't exist. They're there for a reason, and God is going to do something great. Verse 11. Now, David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah. Right? Bethlehem, Judah, named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years. The 3 eldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to the battle, and the names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, and next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 eldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days the Philistines came forward and took his stand morning and evening. It didn't dawn on me till just now. He would do it in the beginning of the battle, and he would do it at the end of the battle, morning and evening. So what we find here in verses 12 through 16 is David's home and work life. David was a very busy young man. We find out that his dad is really old. His brothers, 8 of them, he is the youngest, and they don't like him. They're mean to him, and they think evil of him. That's going to come up a little bit in the end of the story. And he is also the youngest. For there to be a process, there's on average 2 to 3 years in between children. So if you have 8 children, there's almost 20 years in between the firstborn to the youngest. That's a lot of space. That's the difference between me and my brother. I'm the youngest of 7. He's 50-something. He's going to go talk to his 3 eldest brothers, and he's down here, and they're just going to talk trash to him. And they're going to be like, what are you doing here, dude? Like, get out of here. Not only does he have a little bit of trouble at home, but he also has 2 jobs. What are his 2 jobs? Playing for Saul when he's feeling bad, feeding the sheep. He's a shepherd. So he's responsible to be out in the fields, and he's also responsible to be at the palace. It's kind of an interesting dichotomy. So when he was not with Saul, he was at home. When he was not at home, he was with Saul. It makes a difference here, or it makes a distinction saying that his elder brothers stayed with Saul all the time. They were warriors. They were in the army, and they followed Saul. But it says that David came and went. We're going to find out later that David is known but not very well known. Verse 17. And Jesse said to David his son, take for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain and these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp to your brothers. Also take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000. See if your brothers are well, and bring some token from them. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. And David rose early in the morning, and left the sheep with the keeper, and took the provision and went, as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle, shouting the war cry. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. And David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage, and ran to the ranks, and went and greeted his brothers. And he talked with them. Behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before, and this time David heard him. So what we find here is God's divine hand. The Philistines, his father, and David appearing in battle right on time. Not only did God allow the Philistines into the land, he allowed them into David's land. David was the one who was in the community that was threatened. It was his family, his livelihood that the Philistines were attacking. And not only that, but his father very opportunistically said, hey, you need to go bring provisions to your brothers. They need food, and bring food to the commanders. Go and do these things. And then when David shows up, they're coming to battle first thing in the morning, and it is right when Goliath stands up to do his little show and dance, his little peacock scene. David's going to hear this, and he's going to respond to it. And God is making all of these things happen so that David can respond. And we're going to find that David has been getting trained. If we remember that last lesson we had last week, that David's training started in small things and it grew into bigger things. And this is the opportunity to come out. This is the opportunity that David can shine. In verse 20, we find that David is a person who understands authority. When he's given directions, he takes them. And this is very common for young siblings. You see your elder siblings just get like beat up and pushed around and put in their place, and you learn lessons the easy way. You watch those in front of you, and you learn the lessons that they learn before you get there. So David is humble. David is apt to listen and obey. And as soon as his father says, hey, I need you to go do this thing, he's like, well, Dad, I'm taking care of the sheep. I mean, you can't expect me to go to the battle too, right? Like, it's dangerous over there, right? No, he's like, okay, cool, let's do it. Yeah, no problem. Kind of reminds me of Joseph when his dad's like, hey, go find your brothers in the wilderness. He's like, Dad, but they're going to kill me. No, he's like, all right, let's go. Verse 21, what's interesting is if you were walking along and you saw, let's say, 50,000 people going to a battle and they were getting ready. It's very similar to watching like watching baseball. If you ever see them like warming up, like these guys are over here, they're stretching, and these guys are over here, they're stretching. There's the dude swinging, the dude throwing, and the dude, like stretching his legs. When you show up and you see all these guys putting their armor on and they're getting their battle lines and you know somebody's about to die, would you run in there? Probably not. So David's courage puts him in the middle of the battle. He's like, oh man, the battle's happening right now. He's like, hey, you stay with the bags. You stay here and make sure everything's good with our things. I'm going to go see my brothers. Not only does he go in there, straight to the front line, but he hears the confrontation of Goliath. And what's his response? He heard it. What this is going to do is this is going to spark his zeal for God. Where other people get afraid, David gets angry. Where other people shake, he gets excited. But David is going to stand out and be unique. And let's see that in verse 24. Verse 24. All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel, right? To shame us, to speak sharply against us. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. And David said to the men who stood by him, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in the same way, so it shall be done to the man who kills him. Really, he says, who is this guy? Who does he think he is, that he gets to speak against the armies of the living God? David's theology says this group of people here are not a people who live in the land. They are a people gathered under the name of Yahweh. They are God's people, his army, and for you to resist them, for you to defy them, for you to speak out against them, you're speaking against his people. And so he gets zealous and he challenges who this guy is. But what's interesting is he says, well, what do you get if you fight this guy? What's the reward for killing this guy? And they told him, you get to marry his daughter and you get good things and you get to be free, because the king enslaves everybody. Verse 28, now Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men. And Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, why have you come down, and with whom have you left these few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. And David said, what have I done now? Was it not but a word? And he turned away from him towards another and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him again as before. What's fascinating about David is there's times where he's quiet. There's times where he's reserved. He's the humble shepherd. He's the youngest brother. Nobody listens to him. In the courts of Saul, people saw that he had wisdom. People saw that he could play an instrument, that he was great at singing, but nobody notices him. Nobody acknowledges his existence. But what's fascinating is that the Lord, if we remember when he was anointed, the Lord came upon him, the Spirit of God came upon him from that day forward, and his character starts to change. He starts to be a different person. So here, he's networking, he's talking, and he's talking a lot. He speaks his mind, and when his brother talks to him and says, you have evil intentions, you're doing wrong, you're only here for your own selfish desires, he doesn't stop. He's not deterred. He continues pressing in and pressing on. God is doing something. And I imagine that David's like, man, I'm just intrigued. I just want to talk to everybody about this. I just want to sit there and ask every single person the same question I just asked the last guy. That's the image we get, is that he gets the answer and he turns around and he asks the same question to somebody else. And he just keeps talking to people. On a side note, networking can be a powerful tool in life. And here, David builds his notoriety by just talking to people. And people start to take notice. In verse 31, it says, when the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. This became so noticeable that people were like, there's this kid, there's this guy who's in the ranks at the front line talking about Goliath, talking to the people, saying, what do you get? What's the reward for doing this? And it gets all the way back to the king, and the king's like, who is this guy? Go get this guy. I want to talk to him. If he's talking to everybody, then he should be talking to me. So David gets there, and he talks to him. Verse 32, and David said to Saul, and he sent for him. Verse 32, and David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with the Philistines. This is the first thing he does. He's like, who are you? He's like, don't worry, man. Don't be afraid. I got this. All of Israel, everybody, all the soldiers, everybody who's been there, anybody who's anybody is not willing to step up to this guy. And David, with confidence, says, you guys don't have to worry. I'll take care of this. Verse 33, and Saul said to David, you're not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him, for you're but a young man, and he's been a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered him out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them. For he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of the Philistines. And Saul said to David, go and the Lord be with you. David's confidence is interesting because we like to call it boasting. We like to call it pride. We like to say, well, you're talking too much about your accomplishments. You're making it about you. But when you go to an interview, you have to make your skills known. It is not boasting. It is not pride. It is speaking the truth. It's your resume. And this is all David is saying. Look, I can do the job. He's not saying he's better than everybody else. He's not saying that in comparison to other people, I'm pretty great. All he is saying is that the Lord has been with me. I've been in some tough situations, and I can handle this. And his confidence inspires confidence. But what's great is that his confidence is not in himself, it's in the Lord. He says, God delivered me from those enemies. God will deliver me from this enemy. His faith in the Lord inspires confidence in Saul. Saul is a man of little to no faith. So it's interesting. He says, go and the Lord be with you. It's like, God bless you. Verse 38. Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put on a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped his sword over his armor. And he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So David put them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. Here, this is all about preparation. David didn't just wake up one day and said, you know what, I feel like I'm going to go conquer my greatest enemy and greatest foe. David did what he was supposed to do on a daily basis for an extended period of time, and when the test, the call, the problem arose, he had the skill, he had the tools, and he felt confident to accomplish it. He had been obedient in everyday small tasks. He cared enough for a small little lamb for long enough that when he was confronted with the largest challenge in his life, he was prepared. And when the world around him said, hey, you know what? For you to be successful, you need to do these things. You need to put on this armor. You need to use this weapon. He said, I can't do it that way. I have to do it the way that I've prepared. I have my way of doing it. I have a specific function that I function with, and I need to do it my way. So he tried. He's like, let me put this helmet on. This is kind of a weird feeling helmet. I've never had weight on my head like this. And let me put this armor on. Oh man, this stuff's really heavy. I don't think I'm strong enough to carry this. And let me put this sword on. You know, I'm not actually all that well trained in a sword. I mean, I've swung a sword a couple times, but my staff, that feels a lot better in my hand. And that sling, I'm pretty good at throwing that sling. So you know what, guys? I don't trust what you're giving me. I trust the tools that have been with me that the Lord used to deliver me in the past. And I'm going to keep those tools on me. These are well worn and capable of doing the job. So he puts off that armor. He puts off what was given to him to fight. And what's interesting is the way that the Philistine is dressed is the way that they tried to dress David. He's got a spear, and he's got a sword, and he's got a helmet, and he's got armor, and he's got this. You need it too. And David's like, no. It's okay if I'm not equal to that guy. It's okay if I don't do everything the way that he does it, because the Lord's going to use me in his own way to do his will. Verse 41, he steps up and he steps in front of Goliath, and this is what ensues. And the Philistine moved forward and came near David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not by sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. Solid. What's happening here is psychological warfare. This is what the Philistine has been doing for 40 days. He steps up and he uses his prowess to defeat his enemies before they even get close to him. They're afraid of him before they can even fight him. They've already lost the battle because he challenges them mentally first. And when he tries to do the same thing with David, he's like, my God is greater. He's doing the same thing. And he's like, you're a little dog. Or he says, like, am I a dog? And you're a stick, right? You know what dogs do with sticks? They chew on them. They spit them out. They carry them around and they do whatever they want with them. And that's what he says. I'm going to cut you into pieces and the birds are going to eat you. David has no sympathy, no patience for that. And he responds quick and he says this, you think you're strong and you think you're capable, but you know what? My God's going to give you into my hand. He has already fought this battle in his heart, and he knows that the Lord will deliver him. He goes in knowing the outcome of the battle. From day one, from the very moment that he talked to Saul, he said this, God will deliver me. And then when he gets to the end, he says this, you know why God's going to deliver me? So that everybody knows, everybody sees, and everybody acknowledges there is a living God in Israel. And he doesn't use swords, and he doesn't use shields, because he's not carrying a sword, and he's not carrying a shield. And he will save us. And I'm going to not just kill you, but we're going to take out all of you, and we will feed all of you to the birds. And that was said and done. Verse 48, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into the forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword, drew it out of its sheath, and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Shaaraim as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. And David took the head of the Philistines and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. So this is faith in action, and this is a shocking victory. What's interesting is what was at stake? All or nothing. Total slavery. If we win, you got to bow down. If you win, we'll bow down. And as soon as they lost, what'd they do? They're like, nah, no deal. And they took off. Now I can just imagine all the Israelites sitting there, and I'm curious. David had sat there and talked to all of the army of Israel. Like he talked to so many people that it got all the way back to the king. And if he inspired confidence in the king, what do you think the effect was on the soldiers? So when he went out there and crushed this dude, this took like 2 minutes max. We got to recognize that they took up to the battle lines. Goliath stepped forward. David stepped out. They had a little micmash in language. And David's like, nope, we're starting. And as soon as Goliath stepped forward, David took off running. David's like, let's do this. Game on, right? Have you guys ever played Capture the Flag? So I'm the person that sprints. You got those who are like, let me just sneak around, nice and cunning and smart. Nah, not me. I'm like, they won't see me coming. I'm going to be the first one there. I'm going to shock them. I'm so fast. That's what David did. He took off, he grabbed a stone and threw it, which tells me that David didn't tell him what he was going to do. David didn't show him that he had a sling. David didn't show him that he had a stone in the sling. David waited for the moment when the battle started to reveal his hand. And that happened in a split second. All he had to do was take 15 steps, get a sling in, boom, game over. You can tell it was game over because Goliath fell face forward. He was in mid-stride walking forward, and he just fell right on his face, and he was out. David runs over, picks up the sword, and kills him. Was Goliath alone? It says that his shield bearer was in front of him. Goliath is standing here, and he's got this little man here. I'm going to call him a little man because Goliath is big. He's got this little man in front of him. So he steps out and starts walking and then falls face down. David runs over, grabs his sword, cuts his head off. What's this other dude doing? He's just like, he's in shock. What just happened? I can imagine him just starting to shake. He's like, who is this kid? Who is this guy? No armor, no sword, nothing. A sling? Seriously? So he picks up the sword and he cuts off his head. Then everybody shouts. I feel like Israel's actually prepared for this one. Israel is like, here we go, game on. I think David really inspired them. And they went out and they conquered. This is a throwback to the days of Jonathan. Jonathan inspired Israel. Jonathan was a leader. And his father, Saul, is a failure. He doesn't inspire confidence, and he himself is severely depressed and disabled. That's why David is even there playing his music. So the army's depressed, the people are depressed, and David comes in, shakes it up, brings revival, and everybody takes off. So let's look at the spoil. Verse 53, the people of Israel came back. 54, and David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. What was the spoil that David got? The head and the armor and the sword. What's interesting is all the people pillaged the Philistines' camp. The Philistines obviously didn't think that they were going to lose because they left everything behind. And so all the people got their kind of take of the spoils. David takes the head and he takes the armor and the sword, but the sword isn't mentioned. Why is the sword not mentioned? Where did he put the armor? Took it back to his house. Where does he put the sword? He gives it to the Lord. Later on, Saul is going to be chasing David. David has no time to react, and he flees for his life. And he actually hits the temple. He hits the priests, and he says, I need a weapon and I need food. And they give him the showbread, which nobody's allowed to eat unless you're a priest. And then they say, the only sword that we have here is Goliath's sword. And he's like, it'll do. He gives it to the Lord. He says, you know what? This victory, this weapon right here, it's the Lord's. And he gives it to the Lord, to the church. So it's the idea of a tithe. It's his way of giving glory to God. It doesn't say it, but that's where we find out the sword ends up. And I always ask the question, like, why didn't David have the sword to begin with? Like, it was his sword. If he didn't use it to give glory to God, it wouldn't have been there when he needed it. Verse 55, as soon as Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this guy? And Abner said, as your soul lives, O king, I don't know. And the king said, inquire whose son the boy is. And as soon as David returned from striking down the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? And David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse, Bethlehemite. It's interesting because we know that David had a relationship with Saul, and it specifically says that Saul loved David in the last chapter. So how is it that Saul doesn't know David? David is the one who soothed his woes. David is the one who sang of the mercies of God and lifted his spirit up, who brought grace into his life. Saul is self-absorbed. That's a very good one because it's true. He's not able to see the people around him because he's too focused on himself. So this inquiry of who is your father, a lot of people look at this and they say, well, the Bible is inaccurate. The Bible can't be true because it says he knows him, but he doesn't know him, and he loves him, but he doesn't love him. The problem with that is the fact that there's hundreds of servants in Saul's life. There's the military campaigns he's fighting. There's the national security he has to deal with. There's taxes, and then there's all of this stuff. And so he's not concerned with a small nobody who's insignificant. It's just another face. It's another, hey, bring the singer. Bring the guy. I'm having the thing. I got it. I got the thing going on. Help me out. So David would come and go. He would go into the palace, but he was never really acknowledged there. People said like David would say things and they'd be like, oh, that was really good. Or like, okay, thanks. And they wouldn't acknowledge the person. He's small, he's insignificant, and he's unimportant. Nobody cares about him until today, until the day of victory, until the day that the Lord made. God prepared him, established the day that he should defeat the greatest foe that Israel had seen in some time, and that his name would be catapulted to the top, to the point where women start to sing, and that he's got the #1 hit on the radio, that David slays his 10,000s. David is going straight to the top, but it's only because he was so far at the bottom. And remember David's heart. As we move forward, remember what he said. God is going to do something great. Do you remember why? Do you remember what David said, why God would do this? Why is God going to do something great in our lives? Why is he going to do something great in the world? Why is it that he used David so that everybody would know that there is a God in Israel? That everybody would see and know that there is Yahweh, the living God. That is the whole point. It's that God would be acknowledged for who he is and what he does. He does not deliver by sword and shield or spear, but he uses small things to make big impact. And that's what we found through the whole Bible so far. We find God's plan is using the most unlikely people to do the greatest things, like Jonathan. You think it would be Saul, the king, who's big, bad, and wonderful. But it wasn't. It was his son, who just decided that by himself would go do something. So here's the application. 1 Corinthians 15. Let's turn there real quick. 1 Corinthians 15. It's such a good section because it is the clearest presentation of the gospel. Paul is like, hey, remember that I preached the gospel to you? Death, burial, resurrection. Sup, son, according to the scriptures. Really good stuff. Verse 9, he says, I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace towards me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. Whether then it was I or they, so we preached and you believed. There's this concept that David is a mighty man of war. David is a strong hand or a strong weapon in God's hand. David was well-trained, well-prepared, and capable. He was confident, and he did what he was born to do. That's God's grace. And what Paul says here is that David trained, but God was doing all the work. David did more work than anybody, but it was not him, it was God in him. And that's the importance that we need to remember. When David was anointed king as a nobody, as the last, the lowest, and the least in his family, the Spirit of God came upon him from that day forward. God was working in him his good will. That which pleased him is what God was doing inside David. But what did David do every day? He put a rock in his sling, he spun it around, and he threw it. And then he took a rock and he put it in a sling, he spun it around, and he threw it. And he did it hundreds and thousands of times. He took care of the little sheep, and when something confronted him, he fought him off. He did his job, and God's grace was not in vain. In fact, David was more successful than everybody else because of God's grace. And God's grace made him train harder than anybody else. So Paul says the same thing about himself. And he says, I'm the lowest, I'm the last, I'm the least, but God's grace is not in vain. I work harder than anybody. But guess what? It's not me. It's God in me. Because we want everyone to know there is a God, and his name is Jesus.